As if this year wasn't scary enough. Take a listen to this. I inaugurate this account with the recollection of an evening that will forever curdle my memory with disturbing and horrific detail. A later twilight in fortune's time that will haunt my future imagination with inevitable and merciless drear. The vague and vast climate of the night was seamless in generating an ambiance of dismay, and the air was dense with anxiety that lurked somewhere in the shadows of my subliminal fret. The illusion of my mind was saturated with vile and wicked consideration, disallowing sensations of humoristic reason. The occasion was of unwavering nightmarish profusion, and I stand in fear the witness of horrid events that just now have beset the innocence of my eyes. The thunder of my pulse recedes, as thought and memory begin to flood my temple with the hope of witnessing mercy. Murder has bore victory over the dreaming imagination of the slumbering man that now rests silently without motion between the sheets of self-inflicted death. It began in anonymous fashion, as I took my evening saunter through the winding, vacant ways of the neighborhood. These late nightly walks through expressionless vicinities had once been revered as a time to collect thoughts and claim some minuscule stake on the countless undertakings and perceptions of the day. In time just preceding the event in which I currently fumble to illustrate, though, the distant and feverish wander embodied routine and monotonous meandering. However, in the intermediate frame of my journey on this fate-tainted nightfall, I perceived an irregular measure of misfortune in the air. My breath was filled with fog-infested agony that launched apprehension through the vein of my quickening steps. My strongest perception, displaying fear and uncertainty, forced my footsteps onward as my jittery gaze danced forward and back in the humid orange glow of street lamps around me. My stubborn will fought frantically with fancy as I fixed regard on logic rather than lunatic imagination. Nevertheless, the following optical impulse cast reason fully from the extent of my assumptive brain and restored it instead with disbelief and horror. From the haunting shadows of the night-filled street, my eyes were engaged by a fit of bedsheets in the window of a house in which I happened to be passing by. It gripped my eager eyes with such physical torment that I couldn't help but stare at the thrashing white mass of discomfort. A figure remained securely beneath the sheet, while heaving his body about in such proportions that the very physics of human flexibility were being revised. The display was repulsive and torturous in magnitude, and gave only greater demand to my viewing. I stood silently, sweating as the jolting shocks to the figure in the window became more rhythmically violent. The young man seemed to reach and cry persistently for alleviation from the persecuting bonds of his distress. I caught my infant brain pondering the reason and supply of this poor gentleman's ailments. Was this a raging seizure, or a physical display deliberately meant to trick and stun the eyes and mind of a passerby, or a hallucination of my own accord? Could it be a nightmare of divine caliber, delivered insistently from the mud-drunken bounds of satanic hell? Either way, I found myself removed from the lurking unknowns of the Black Night and transfixed elsewhere in the cruel mental manifestation and sensations of the stranger, which I had viewed with curious intoxication. Like the sands of time that cascade silently and with unshakable motivation between pyramids of glass, I found my very essence falling, deep and swift between the dimension of my physical self and that of my imagination. It was as though I had suddenly been slurred through a mystifying universal warp in time and teleportonic space, and without warning or insight into the confirmation of my current position, I felt my entire skin pressed viciously beneath the iron surface of the bedspread. My arms and legs fought hysterically for surrender from the cotton-white suffocation as my breath and pulse raged with uncharacteristic fatigue. I was now cramped inside the nightmare, whose flooding desperation took hold of my senses. A sudden, gentle and irritating scratch or scrape on the outside wall nearest my head sent me plunging further into delirium, for I could paint flawlessly on the palette of my mind's eye the exact image of a black widow digging adamantly on the wall outside. The monster's astonishing size and unequivalent work efficiency elevated my fears enormously. The itch it cast from the peeling wall drove frenzy echoing so loudly through my brain that I could hardly sense the small trickle of blood that took departure from my ears. I knew undoubtedly that this black satin viper would only find full satisfaction upon the dipping of its dagger fangs into the throbbing hot stream of my blood. By now, the fracturing crack of my skeleton against the pretending bonds of linen had syncopated rhymes with the dreadful itch whose tones sent the fluid of my core sprinting through the fibrous and tender limit of my veins. The feverish toll of my heart bred turbulent panic with each and every wicked pitch of that fiend's ambitious scuff. The grating, grazing grind of its claws against the timber echoed shivering jolts of dull sensation through the nervous extent of my spine. The wheezy scream and breath of my heaving lungs was so corroded with impending vacancy that I felt the very animation of my soul siphon silently away. Then, silence. Unconditional silence, whereas not even the rolling hum of the earth could be perceived. Where life itself in the trace of a half-second halts to become a cooling accumulation of withering cells. This was the sweet peace that endured over the resonance of that last victorious abrasion of the foul creature who now surely embezzles relief beside the overtaxed and fatigued condition of my numbing dead remains. And again, silence. Within the sliver of time between the flicker of my lids, I found myself again positioned in the street. Standing rickety in the whipping winds of the approaching storm, I felt the frozen beads of my sweaty brow dissolve beyond the darkened sky. I was halted, weak-kneed and teary on the brink of a muddled epiphany. I quivered with amusement at the intensity at which my fancy could so easily propel me between anguish and relief. And just as quickly as I found retreat toward the hoping peace of just a dream, I was pummeled ruthlessly into the shackles of morbid disbelief. There, in that slender, loosened frame, sat the form of the man whose dreams I just mistook. The silent echo of his scream was captured perfectly in the rigid folds cast into the jagged contours of cotton clenched taut along his dead face. As my hearing stared at the motionless sound behind the sheet, my annihilated core was startled once again by the wicked tolls of that beast upon the wall. And just as conveniently as my prior diligence caused descent into despair, I derived just now a droll delight in the confirmation awarded to the collision of my hearing and sight. The author of this heinous lullaby appears to be the undulating bough of that meager pine positioned ruinously at the corner of the wall. As the tender breeze sends another gnarled caress into the coat of that mortal asylum, I resist pondering the slur of that dreaming man, the simple virtue of the evergreen, and the extent of lunacy nestled in the vault of my own imagination.